Donal Fallon is one of Ireland's most respected public historians, celebrated for bringing Dublin's social history to life through engaging storytelling. Best known as the creator and host of the acclaimed Three Castles Burning podcast, Fallon explores the people, streets, traditions, and overlooked events that have shaped Ireland's capital. His best-selling book, Three Castles Burning, A History of Dublin in 12 Streets, expands on themes from the podcast, revealing the city's evolution through its streets, communities, and forgotten characters. Through his writing, broadcasting, and public engagement, Donal has become one of the foremost interpreters of Dublin's identity and history. Donal also has a deep appreciation for the work and legacy of Con Houlihan, the celebrated writer from our very own Castleisland. He frequently acknowledges Houlihan's literary style, humanity, and insight as an enduring influence on his own approach to history, writing, and public engagement. I hope you enjoy this wonderful and insightful talk by Donal Fallon on the life of Con Houlihan.
I was delighted to accept the invitation to speak at this event and to speak of one of Castleisland's two words, most celebrated sons. And I knew of this place and its neighbouring landscape of Knocknagoshel and beyond from the columns of Houlihan long before I ever set foot in it. A little context would do no harm at the outset. I'm primarily a historian of Dublin, but more importantly, I'm a child of the southwestern suburbs of the capital, which landed our family firmly in the catchment area of St Patrick's Athletic Football Club. And it was as a child I first encountered the figure of Con Houlihan standing on the Camac Terrace in Inchicore. As he wrote once in the Irish press, he said, "I cannot hide my love for St Patrick's Athletic. A fox may as well try and hide its trail in the snow." So I'm moonlighting a bit lately as a sports historian, as a contributor to the forthcoming Atlas of Irish Sports History from Cork University Press, and an anthology on the League of Ireland that's coming soon from New Ireland. And before getting into this talk, I think Con would delight in the emergence of Kerry FC in recent times. It's great to see the Kingdom in the League of Ireland again. And I was reminded when discussing his perhaps unlikely affection for an Inchicore football club with a fellow supporter at a match last week, he said, "Why is that surprising? The Kingdom has always boasted a great sporting plurality. You know, the County Kerry Cricket Club going strong since the 1870s. Of course, Con liked to tell his readers that what was cricket but the advancement of the classic game of rounders. Rugby, he told his readers, firmly the game of the everyman. And of his own rugby playing days, he would quip that I was never capped for Ireland, but I was kneecapped playing rugby for Castleisland. So, while I'll undoubtedly return to my own personal recollections of watching Con cursing and cheering on St Pat's, I want to give an overview today of the life of Con, drawing on his very own rich archival writings. And I do welcome the chance before you to correct two great wrongs. I know he'd be furious at me in my recent book on Dublin pubs for not spelling Castleisland as two words, as he always insisted. And I described him as a sports writer, which I think is a very poor description for Con. I think he was a writer on life itself. That great image is by Ray McManus, a brilliant sports photographer. But I also love this one by John Minahan. John Minahan is famous as the great photographer of Samuel Beckett. All those brilliant images of Beckett sitting outside a Parisian cafe in black and white were taken by John Minahan. He also photographed Francis Bacon in his London studio, but I love Minahan's shot of Con Houlihan. I think it captures the literary man brilliantly. So Con was born in the winter of 1925 in the aftermath of the Civil War, which had done so much damage to the fabric of Kerry society. And as he always liked to remind people, sport had played a role in healing the divisions of the Civil War. The victorious Gaelic football team of that era included men who had stood on opposing sides of the divide. And he always remembered a Kerry childhood that was rooted in local traditions, but where the Civil War was always in the background. For example, he remembered the Wren Day, going hunting the Wren on St. Stephen's Day, when youngsters would parade through the towns of the Kingdom in straws. In those days, just after the Civil War, he wrote, you had to be very careful what songs you sang, because there was great bitterness in our part of Kerry after the war, and if you offended, you got no money. The Civil War wasn't an abstract thing in his household. His father, Michael, had emigrated to work as a fitter's apprentice in a coal mine in South Wales, but returned in 1923 to support the Republicans in the dying stages of the conflict. And later, Con would write about his dad. In his youth, my father worked in the Welsh coalfield. He learned to love the miners and the Welsh people in general. From listening to him, I began to believe that the Irish were not the only great people in the world. The Civil War was a conflict he would come back to all the time in his columns later on. When Dermot Ferreter's great book, Judging Dev, was published, Con reviewed it, and he was angry that Dermot called him a sports historian. But he wrote about how when the order to dump arms came, quote, my father had only a shotgun, which was more of danger to himself than to any enemy. But on a more serious note, he did say that the Civil War had deeply scarred that part of the country. My mother and father and other members of our family were deeply involved, and they said that the real truth could never be written because no publisher would handle it. There was badness and sadness, he said, on both sides. For someone whose family had taken the anti-treaty position, Con himself was adamant in later years, for example, when he was interviewed by Declan Lynch in Hot Press, or when he was reviewing Dermot Ferreter's book, he really felt that the war had been a mistake and a tragedy. And in his mind, he said that those young men, quote, set out to destroy the infrastructure of the young state. The war attracted many who are honest and brave, but honesty and bravery are double-edged virtues when combined with political innocence. I think it would be a mistake to try and understand Con's politics only within the framework of the Civil War. I think his father, like many veterans of that conflict, struggled to make a living in the new state. He did find work in the local creameries in Castleisland and Currow, going on to become a founding member of the Labour Party in Kerry. And Con said, as soon as I was able to wield the brush and whitewash up James Connolly on an innocent wall, I became a bucket-carrying member of the Labour Party. A bust of Con Houlihan. That's a great book cover, isn't it? Is today behind the bar in the Palace on Fleet Street in Dublin, but was formerly on display in the office of Taoiseach Dick Spring, and Houlihan had canvassed for Spring's father in Kerry. Like his dad before him, he spent a period in Britain. He was there in the early 1940s, kind of mad time to emigrate to Britain, at a time when Ireland knew the emergency, but Britain knew the Blitz. And while his time there was brief, it was really formative. I mean, he developed a great admiration in England for the urban working class. And that was something that remained with him right throughout his life, trying to find that harmony between the rural and the urban. One of the things I think that but as important, and we'll come back to his time in England, as important as that was, I think his childhood here explains a lot about his interests in sport and beyond. I mean, one of the things that really allowed sport to thrive in the 19th century was the railway network. Con was always very romantic about railways and trains. I think the reason he came to follow St. Patrick's Athletic is that we were founded as the Railway Club in Dublin. And the railway allowed athletes and supporters to make their way across the island for matches. Looking at a map of this part of the world today, Station Road remains. And he recounted the much lamented local railway line and what it meant to young people growing up here, that it brought the English newspapers, and for local lads, it provided a window into the beautiful game. He said, it may seem off that we were so fascinated by a game that we'd never seen in the round, but there's no boundary to the imagination. And it was all the more fascinating because we saw it in flickering snatches in the newsreels in the cinemas. His Kerry youth shaped him greatly. He remembered the men, the veterans of the war, who didn't allow little things to bother them. They looked on being alive as a privilege, and they took the days as they came. They needed no telling about life's penchant for irony. They were practiced catchers in the rye. He recalled the great importance of rugby in the community. The poorer people in our community looked on rugby as their game. This attitude was not without a smidgen of irony. Rugby in this country, he wrote, was generally deemed to be the game of those who dwelt in the upper classes. But in the world of sport, you'll find that poverty and passion go hand in hand. No club ever had more fervent followers than ours. And just as some people up in North County Dublin will regale you with tales of how they love cricket and its place in their lives, Houlihan's memory of this part of the world and sport in the broadest sense, I think, similarly gets into that point that we shouldn't understand games as native games or foreign games. Sport is ultimately about recreation and the joy it brings to us. And as he said, in the absence of work, there was lots of time to play whatever game you wanted. But the experience of being a young man working in England, I think, was both a sporting and a literary education. And he would later tell his good friend and the journalist Ian O'Riordan, he said, "London is my second favourite city." And Ian asked him if Dublin was his favourite, and he said, "No, Castleisland." But he said, "My time in London shaped me. I came to believe in what George Orwell called the essential decency of the English people." He told Ian, "A Cockney is a member of London's working class. They're a special breed. Physically, they're very hardy, and they're almost always cheerful. They know little about London outside of their own townships. They're also painfully honest. If you asked a Cockney in Whitechapel how to get to Highbury, he'd apologise and say he didn't have a clue." In 1944, he came back from London, thankfully. He attended University College Cork and studied English, Latin and history. And he graduated with a first-class BA and a Master's in English in 1949. His master's subject was the relationship between poetry and society in 18th century England. I think the time in Cork was really important for him, and I think his devotion to St. Pat's is actually found in that time in Cork. He remembered an FAI Cup match between Evergreen United and the Saints, and the railway being centrally important to this tale. He said, "The faithful travelled down to Cork in a special train. The nucleus of their following was family groups, some represented by 3 generations. They seemed to fear in Inchicore that Cork was experiencing a food shortage. They came well supplied. They took their flasks and their sandwiches. They picnicked on the green grass during the interval. I liked it. I liked their sporting attitude to the game. Pats lost with honour, but it was all very civilised." Before there was a Dublin career, there was the Taxpayers' News, a paper that had the brilliant masthead, "The Voice of the People," published in the late 1950s into 1960 from a butcher shop in Castleisland. And Con remembered it as Castleisland's first and probably last publication. It was at times, in his own words, libelous. A libel case killed it. Local politics can be a dirty business. And there, and more famously later in the Kerryman, while working as a schoolteacher, he published columns which sometimes proved deeply controversial. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind on questions of politics. And I think the best study of Con Houlihan's articles in the Kerryman, Brian Hanley, the historian, in his book, The Impact of the Troubles in the Republic, writes about how the influence of Con's father's politics was very clear. He told readers of the Kerryman, for example, going back to what we've just heard in the last talk, he said, "More than one family of proud Irish merchants laid the foundations of its fortunes in the black market that flourished during the famine years. The early governments of the new state," he told readers, "were all dominated by the freedom fighters of the 5 glorious years, but had only one philosophy in common, that property is sacred, no matter how it is acquired." His denunciation of the bombing campaign in Britain brought real issues for the Kerryman newspaper, and the editor, Seamus McConville, later recalled that a warning was received not to publish another Con Houlihan opinion piece in the paper. And to his great credit as an editor, he did, and he did it on the front page. But the letters pages of the Kerryman reveal a real political tussle in those days. But as well as someone who wasn't afraid to speak his mind politically, Houlihan also emerges in the Kerryman as a really talented cultural writer, and his grasp of literature and his interest in it beyond just the great Irish writers was enough, I think, to catch the attention of David Marcus, who was the literary editor of the Irish Press Group in Dublin. And he changed the life of Con when he asked him to review a book for the Press Group in Burgh Quay. When he took up employment in Dublin with the Evening Press newspaper in the 70s, I think he found his natural home. I mean, his columns, both sporting and culturally focused, achieved much read status. I think in the popular mind, Con was the press, and the press was Con. And he had a great formula for pulling his readers into his columns. A fogre would appear at the end of a column. And a fogre could take the form of a birthday greeting, an anniversary celebration, an event notice, or a historical anniversary in Castleisland was always popular as well. I've met many people for whom appearing in a fogre, it might have been the birth of a child, a wedding, or something similar, was a great boast, and some survive in weathered frames today all over Inchicore. Another thing he would often do in his columns, after a great introductory passage, a column would encourage his readers with the words, "Now read on." And it was often unrequired encouragement, because you were going to anyway. The Burgh Quay Empire spread beyond its own building, of course, and Con became a frequent sight. For example, in Mulligans on Poolbeg Street, the association of that pub with the press was so strong that Declan Lynch later remembered, "I wrote articles for the paper for quite a while without ever entering the actual premises on Burgh Quay. It never seemed necessary when Mulligans was there." Houlihan had his own haunts, which included Mulligans, as well as the Palace, the Scotch House, the White Horse, which was an early house opening at 7 in the morning, Doheny and Nesbitt's, the Lower Deck, and more besides. And there are reminders of Con in all of those establishments that have survived the passing of time. The word memorial is unfitting here because most of these tributes were unveiled in his own lifetime. And in Mulligans, there is a brilliant secular shrine which includes the words of John B. Keane. And John said, "When he entered the sporting scene, the cobwebs of bias and bigotry were blown away by the pure breath of his vision and honesty. I played rugby against him and drank porter with him. We were useful enough players, but we excelled at the other," which is brilliant. Con wrote brilliantly about pubs. Burgh Quay, he said, was the focal point of Dublin, an intimate community with certain pubs for certain people. The Dublin I knew was bound by Mulligans and maybe 10 more around it. First and foremost, you had the White Horse. It would open around 6:30 in the morning if you wanted an early drink. It was unique in that Brendan Beaton could drink there, as long as he stayed in a certain corner and didn't go around bothering people too much. And you found all kinds of humanity there. Bowes on Fleet Street was another. The Swan on Burgh Quay, the Mucky Duck, as we called it, was a journalists' club. The Pearl Bar was frequented by the writers from the Irish Times, all good people, but a niche group. You had Kennedy's, a very respectable pub. Burgh Quay was a village, and I loved it. Before coming to his legendary match reports, of which there are so many, Con's cultural material in the press, I think, has aged brilliantly. And that's not really the stuff we associate with Con. You know, we think about poor Paddy Cullen here when we hear the name Con Houlihan. But the cultural stuff was just marvellous. I mean, he had a lasting friendship with the balladeer Luke Kelly and Deirdre O'Connell, Luke's partner, who was a very important theatre director in Dublin. She founded a theatre called the Focus Theatre, which was a very, very small space, just a few dozen seats. She was a total outsider, Deirdre. She was born in the Bronx in 1939. She had trained at the prestigious Actors Studio, where the graduate list included Marlon Brando and James Dean, but she knew almost nobody in the theatre world of Dublin when she began putting on plays in the Focus. Some of her great actors were Tom Hickey and Sabina Coyne, better known now as Sabina Higgins. But it was Con who really championed that little theatre all the time, and he said that when you went to the Focus Theatre, you were looking at life itself. You weren't looking at theatre at all. And both Luke Kelly and Deirdre attributed the success of the Focus Theatre, at least in part, to the constant encouragement of Con Houlihan and to his brilliant reviews. And almost every ad for that theatre includes a line from Con about the play. He wasn't always convinced by what was fashionable in theatre either. Sacrilegious for a Dubliner to say this, but on the passing of Samuel Beckett, he acknowledged the great bravery of Beckett, Con, but he was honest about his feelings on the work. He said, "How time, that famous almanac, will treat his work, I cannot guess. Even now I feel it's going out of fashion, possibly as a reaction to the hype that lapped around it. to have even the slightest flaw in his work, to feel even the slightest flaw in his work, was to risk banishment from what was called a Dublin polite society. I have seen Waiting for Godot several times, and I still cannot make up my mind about it. But whatever about Beckett, if there was a figure Con admired greatly in the milieu of literary Irish life, I think it was Patrick Kavanagh. And in a lot of ways, I think he kind of moulded parts of himself on Kavanagh. And as James Quinn, one of Con's biographers, says, he was influenced by the celebration of the commonplace in the poetry of Patrick Kavanagh. And like Kavanagh, he cherished his rural upbringing and would often proudly describe himself in literary company as a peasant. I love how he described Kavanagh. I think one of the greatest of all Con Houlihan articles. I first became acquainted with Patrick Kavanagh in circumstances that couldn't have been more apt. I was standing to a cow on the high road that leads from Kerry to Dublin. In simple English, I was minding the cow while she grazed along the acre. About 3 o'clock, my mother, God rest her, brought me a mug of tea, a few slices of bread, and a copy of the Irish Press. When I consumed the sports pages, I returned to the depths of what was then a great paper. On that afternoon, it carried a new column. It was as fresh as the first taste of early potatoes. Robinson Crusoe was hardly more excited when he saw the footprints in the stand. Here was a writer who spoke my language. I could smell the bog and the rushes. And when I came to know his poetry, I had a treasury for life. I had long admired William Butler Yeats, but he was remote from my world. He'd never assisted at a calving. He'd never stood at a fair. I know the great names of modern English poetry, but while I often wrestle with them, I dance with Patrick Kavanagh. T.S. Eliot, in a rare moment of enlightenment, said that it's the artist's task to take the here and the now and to make it rich and strange. Patrick Kavanagh was the supreme exemplar of that. But the form of theatre and the arts and culture with which Con is most synonymous is the theatre of sport. And heroes like Desert Orchid, Kevin Heffernan, Mick O'Dwyer, Brian Kerr all emerge on track and field in his columns. Soccer match reports could be peppered with literary references. And at a time when the League of Ireland had a very, very small community around it, he wrote about it like this was the great occasion of a Friday night. Pats player Mick Moody, those who wanted to know how we fared against Dinamo Bucharest were told, seems determined to disprove that line in Juno and the Paycock. You remember Jocks are saying that nothing good ever came out of Wicklow. He was famously early to the genius of Paul McGrath as well, watching Paul McGrath with a crowd of about 170 people in Inchicore and describing him as the Black Pearl of Inchicore. Richmond Park, he told his readers, is the League of Ireland's Cape Canaveral, and the latest rocket to be fired from there is Paul McGrath. I love the way he wrote about horse racing as well. They said, my neighbours knew horses, not as names in the newspapers and form books. They knew them as creatures of flesh and blood and minds and spirit. He was present at the great international tournaments as well. There really was no shortage of genius at Italia 90. Every brilliant Irish journalist was dispatched, including Colm Tóibín, who wrote brilliantly about it. He said most of the supporters were urban, mostly from Dublin. In a country that pays so much attention to the nuances of dress, the hordes of Irish in Italy stood out. Even the beachwear looked as though it had been bought in Cleary's in the late 1950s. Now, wonderful as that was, it was Houlihan who produced the defining line of the Irish coverage of Italia 90. He had an acute sense that as great as it was to be out there in Italy writing about it, the real fun was at home. And describing the tournament retrospectively, Con said, I missed Italia 90. I was in Italy at the time. But the greatest coverage of all came from the native games. I think he just really enjoyed being a proud Kerry man in Dublin in those years of tussle between Kerry and Dublin. And his relationship with the GAA could be turbulent. He was one of the finest opponents of the ridiculous ban, which prohibited the playing of foreign games. And when the Steadfast Rule was published, which was a defence of the ban, he described it as being as if someone had sent a get-well card to a person already dead. But working with the press, he was in the capital at this defining time as Dublin's relationship with Gaelic football was transformed. A terrace culture emerged, which remains to this day, for better or worse, in Hill 16. Heffo's army was born. And O'Dwyer and Heffernan really was the stuff of absolute legend. Mick O'Dwyer later tipped his hat and said that Heffernan brought Dublin back from the dead. There were astonishing games. The 1975 All-Ireland final, when the Kerry captain is unable to accept the Sam Maguire as he's been knocked unconscious during the game. On one occasion, when Kerry defeat Dublin, Con famously writes that Hill 16 was as quiet as Knocknagoshel on a Good Friday morning. But what may be the finest words in the history of Irish sports journalism were penned in 1978, when Houlihan poetically described the frantic dash of Dublin goalkeeper Paddy Cullen, the save Kerry man Mikey Sheehy's lobbed effort from afar. And suddenly, Paddy dashed back towards his goal like a woman who smells a cake burning. The ball won the race, and it curled inside the near post as Paddy crashed into the outside of the net and lay against it like a fireman who'd returned to find his station ablaze. When poor Paddy Cullen died in recent years, the names Paddy Cullen and Con Houlihan were trending together on Google searches that day. The closure of the Irish press and the evening press in 1995 took many people by surprise. The staff occupied the premises, and they produced their own newspaper, the Express, later from Liberty Hall across the river. And Con gave his support to those writers. Frank Kilfeather later remembered the sight of Con Houlihan, the evening press columnist, standing on the O'Connell Bridge with a can in his hand, collecting money for the Workers' Fund, was heartbreaking. Con later remembered it was like being part of the barricades of 1871, a great feeling of fever and revolution, yeast and goodness, total integrity. Was like a honeymoon at the end of your life. Liam Mackey, one of the journalists involved in that strike newspaper, remembered collecting Con's pieces. 3 times a week at around noon, I would repair to the Irish Press Annex, better known as Mulligans, on Poolbeg Street, to meet with the Castleisland Colossus, receive his latest handwritten manuscript, read it aloud in his presence for mutual satisfaction, and then head back across the river to the War Office in Liberty Hall to type it up for publication in the Express. Con remained a frequent face and sight around the city, even after the closure of the press group, but I don't think he was ever entirely happy in any newspaper after that. I love this image, which was taken in his home on Martin Street in Portobello, down there by the canal. He's still very fondly remembered in that part of the city. In the Harold House, one of his regulars and one of mine, they still recall that curious concoction of brandy and milk. When asked why he drank brandy and milk, he would reply by saying that the brandy took the sting out of the milk. His real magic, I think, in later pieces, though, which became more autobiographical, was in trying to find the country in the city. So if you take his description of the Royal Oak, which is a pub beside Kilmainham Jail, down a little laneway known as Kilmainham Lane, he said, "It's like a piece of the country in the heart of the city. It has green spaces and hedges and trees, and there you can hear the birds sing. There too you'll find the little pub, which from the outside looks like a private house. This is the old Royal Oak, and long may it last." He loved the company of others till the very end. His door was always open on Martin Street. And despite his decades in the capital, he retained that wonderful Kerry accent that Dubliners always struggled to understand and talked, as you'll remember, quietly into his hand. I love James Quinn's description of a courtly, eloquent English in his soft, Kerry accented mumble. He died in 2012 at the age of 86. The latter years of his life were greatly impacted by a fall at the Cheltenham races, which restricted his mobility. And like the painter Jack Butler Yeats before him, Jack spent his own final years in a nursing home in Portobello, right beside Con's house. Con was content walking the neighbouring canal alongside nature. I think he liked anywhere in Dublin where you could close your eyes and think you were back in Kerry. And just as he delighted in the sight of 2 young mallard, a duck and a drake on the Camac during a St. Pat's game, the swans and the heron of Portobello were a part of his Dublin that made him feel at home too. He was undoubtedly Ireland's most cherished and respected sports writer. His obituary in The Guardian said that he brought people to the sports pages who normally never bothered with sport, and that due to his writing, he improved immensely the overall standard of sports journalism in this country. That's still true. He was a pioneering figure in giving the domestic football league, the soccer league, the attention and the affection it deserved, and he remains one of its eternal characters. That such a man took our little club to his heart will always be a source of much pride to the fans of the Athletic. At his funeral, his coffin was draped in the blue and red striped jersey of Castleisland Rugby Club and the Starry Plough, the flag of Irish socialism, devised in the days of James Larkin and James Connolly. And a friend reportedly stated that day that Con had gone, quote, to some little snug corner of the great pub in the sky. This painting by the brilliant Kerry artist Liam O'Neill, of course, his studio and his practice is in Dangannicouche. That painting now hangs in the Palace Bar on Fleet Street and was unveiled on the 100th anniversary of Con's birth last December. So he's on the wall forever beside Miles Nagopoline, Seamus Heaney, and I think he'd be particularly happy to be on the wall beside Patrick Kavanagh. It's one of the 4 paintings. So, Gurmila Malgrif, thank you all very much. Thank you.